Week was Rav Kook's Yahrzeit, and I thought that for my Dvar Torah I would share with you some thoughts about Rav Kook and his personality and what he stood for. He's obviously one of the most important thinkers in the 20th century. He led the way in terms of orthodoxy becoming part of the Zionist movement, and he's often associated with Zionism and religious Zionism, but the truth is that that's not really the kernel of his thought. And in the next few minutes I want to share with you what I think that is and how that ties to Zionism, and most importantly how that ties to the month of Elul. And I'll do that with a story. Rav Kook had a student by the name of Moshe Zeidel who went to study Semitic languages at university, and as we know, what they study at university doesn't always jive with our emunah and with our tradition, and he had a lot of questions. And some of the most famous letters that Rav Kook writes is to Moshe Zeidel in answer to these questions. One of the questions he asked was, we see the ancient Near Eastern laws, like the Hammurabi codes and other laws given many centuries before the Torah, speak in a way that is very similar to the Torah. There are laws that are similar to the Torah. They're structured very similarly to the Torah. How do we explain this? Rav Kook answers in one of these famous letters and says that before the giving of the Torah, even in idolatrous society, there were ethical people, there were morals that were developed, there were laws that were developed that were good laws. And when HaKadosh Baruch Hu chose to give us the Torah, he took the laws that man had already created that fit with the Torah's worldview and put them into the Torah in that fashion, which is a fascinating insight and teaches us a lot about the ancient Near East, about Torah, about making sense of archaeology. But most importantly, what this teaches us is something very deep about Rav Kook. And that is he was able to see in the very mundane, not only mitzvah, but he was able to see kedusha. He was able to say human beings were able to create and reach godly laws, and God himself included them in his Torah, which is a huge revolution in religious thinking. And that is perhaps how I would summarize Rav Kook, although you can't summarize him. He was able to look into things and say they're completely mundane, but there are sparks of holiness. There are things there that we can say they're good in and of themselves. And that's the same reason why he was a supporter of Zionism and the return to Eretz Yisrael, because even though it was largely a secular movement, sometimes even anti-religious, he was able to see the sparks of holiness. How is this tied to the month of Elul? So on Sunday, Rav Kook's Yahrzeit, I, together with 7 other chevra, took part in the Fed 3-Peak Challenge. 41 kilometers through Yorkshire, beautiful country, and 1,500 meters ascent, 3 peaks. It was a long day, but it was well worth it, a great achievement. What I wrote to the chevra just before we started was that this is the perfect way to begin the month of Elul. Because just like we have a spiritual aspect to tshuva, we also have a physical aspect to tshuva. Rav Kook writes in the beginning of his sefer called Orot HaTshuva, the Lights of Repentance. He writes at the very beginning that natural tshuva, physical tshuva, material tshuva of our body is intimately tied to spiritual tshuva. You can't have one without the other. And he means this in a very real way, that you need to fix your body health-wise, exercise-wise, in order to fix your soul, and vice versa. When you fix your soul, the healthier you get in a very physical way. And again, seeing again how Rav Kook is able to take something that is relatively mundane, although there's a mitzvah to guard our bodies, but he's able to take that and say, no, there are actually sparks of holiness here. And everything that we do is actually tied to our spiritual well-being. Everything we do is tied to how we worship HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We should all have a meaningful month of Elul. We should all take this opportunity to reflect on ourselves, but also reflect on how we treat our bodies, how we treat our minds, and work together.